The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Chairman, occasionally in this House one comes across legislation whose aims, or the aims of which, are entirely laudable, but the implementation of which are entirely mistaken. And this is one of those bills. Mr Chairman, Labor and the Greens both supported this legislation to Select Committee. We did so because we took the government at its word. This was a bill that was ostensibly designed, sir, to improve the quality of environmental reporting. And we take no joy, sir, in now in this committee stage having to take the floor and say that the committee's analysis and the submissions to it have revealed such fundamental flaws in the drafting that we can no longer support the bill. Such fundamental flaws, sir, that we are forced to the position where we believe they are designed in. And let me be clear about why. Sir, there is some discussion that we'll come to in later parts about Clause 18 and what so many submitters saw as a fundamental flaws that ministers by regulation could set the topic. I said we'll come to that later. Sir, what I wish to turn our attention to is Part 1, Clause 3, the amended purpose clause. Now, sir, it's very interesting that the bill as reported back from the Select Committee described the all-important purpose of the Act as to require independent reports, perhaps? No, nothing about independence. Fact-based reports? No, nothing about evidence. Simply regular reports. And regular, sir, is a bar that is far too low for our precious environment. Sir, the old version of the purpose had such radical language as to specify that it wanted regular reports on the state of the atmosphere and climate. I wonder the government didn't want that in. Fresh water, I can see why they didn't want that in. Just go ask Ruataniwha. Land and marine domains. Just ask Maui's dolphin. It had a prior clause which sought to ensure that the producers of environmental reports, quote, act independently and provide fair and accurate reports. Well, that was all too much for the government. That got struck out by majority. To ensure that the expertise of government departments is utilised, that means that it's evidence-based, and to affirm the role of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in reporting on reports and the processes that produce the report. So the watchdog, sir, is not only the watchdog on the issue, but the watchdog on the integrity of the process which defines the issue, and both are essential. What do we find further down in the interpretation section, Clause 4? Well, we scan down, we go E, F, G, and then we jump to I. The only I word, sir, is impact. There is no independence defined in the bill. The principle of independence is missing. It has been excoriated from the draft legislation. And the Minister has the temerity to ask why the opposition can no longer support this mistaken piece of drafting. Sir, it is no accident. This government has a stock-in-trade technique. It is one that has been employed repeatedly in New Zealand. It is one that the same consultants have advised Mr Cameron's British Labour Party, and it's called take an issue where your opponent is making ground, making Mr Cameron's Conservatives, take an issue where your opponents are making ground and cover it like an attacking duel of yachts, take the air off it by offering the light version. And this is environmental reporting light. It lacks teeth in its purpose clause. It lacks independence. It lacks integrity. And it's not the only time the government has tried the light version as a way of getting some public impression of progress while ensuring that the vested interests that stand behind them aren't too threatened. They have an ETS, an emissions trading scheme, light, one which won't change behaviour for decades to come, and where friends of the government routinely pop up in the media and say climate change is a hoax. They have capital gains tax, light, Mr. Chairman. One that you have when you haven't got a capital gains tax, Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Cunliffe, but just concentrate. We're not talking about climate change and other things. Just focus on the bill.
Mr. Chairman,
Honourable David Cunliffe.
You're quite right. We cannot talk about climate change, except insofar as climate change was specifically struck out by the government from Clause 3 in Part 1. In fact, Clause 3B required regular reports on the state of the air, atmosphere and climate, except that it no longer does because the government took it out. That is why climate change is in scope of this debate, sir. In the same way that the ETS has been watered down, in the same way that paid parental leave was watered down, in the same way that the role of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment is in this very section watered down. Because, sir, the Parliamentary Commissioner should be the one who is specifying what topics get reported on. Because the Parliamentary Commissioner is the independent, evidence-based and highly qualified agent who can say what should be in the reports. We do not believe it's appropriate, sir, that a minister, a political actor in the government of the day, and it doesn't matter whether it's the current government or the next government, sir, it's not appropriate for the minister to play a quasi-watchdog role. It is a conflict of interest, sir, for the minister to be the minister's own watchdog. And that is why this bill is so fundamentally flawed. In Part 1, because the purpose has been reduced in Clause 3 to take away anything other than regularity. And sir, if I might, this is yet another example of the kind of, to use a big jargon word, reductionism. Take a concept as worthy as protection and enshrinement of our environment, and then reduce it to something economic, and then reduce that to a business growth agenda, and then reduce that to a private balance sheet, and then privatise the resources of the state so that the ability to effect change is more limited. That is the stock and trade of this government. So, sir, we're opposing this bill because we are sick of government light. We are sick of environmental protection light. We are sick of the purpose clause light. We want real environmental reporting, truly independent, not only in the statistics that are employed from report to report, and sir, I'd concur with the Minister on that. Nobody on this side of the House is criticising the Department of Statistics or its Chief Executive or its Minister. That is not the issue. The issue is one of scope and integrity and the avoidance of the impression of a conflict of interest, because the Minister should not constrain the reporting of the Minister's own outputs. That is why this bill is fundamentally flawed, why it does not, sir, and cannot, sir, achieve its twin objectives of providing independent advice and conveying the public impression of integrity based on evidence and truly systemic independence, not only in the outputs but in the choice of those outputs. And it is in Clause 3 in Part 1 of this bill that the reader gets the first clue about what is really going on here. This is a dance of the veils, sir, and the veil which has just come off is that of the government's true intent. Sir, Clause 5 in Part 1 is the shortest clause in the bill. It simply says, "This Act binds the Crown." And sir, I believe that that is one reason why the Minister wants to retain the power to set the breadth of the reviews, because it does bind the Crown. And the Minister does not want the Crown being bound by a report which is directed or defined by an agency independent to itself. But in so doing, sir, in imposing the constraint which the Minister has later in this bill, the Minister has actually reduced the perceived value of the reporting exercise to something that frankly is not worth the trees that died to produce the legislation. Mr. Speaker, Clause 4A is also important. It is the Treaty of Waitangi clause, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, And it requires that in order to recognise and respect the Crown's responsibility to take appropriate account of te tiriti, sir, it must provide for te ao Māori, the Māori worldview, as an important category in preparing a synthesis. You know, I think future generations of New Zealanders are going to really thank, I was going to say Māori, but it's all New Zealanders and successive governments, Mr. Bishop, for the Treaty of Waitangi. And they will thank successive governments for honouring the treaty with the return of resources, sir, because they're not resources that are going to leave the country. And the treaty here is perhaps the one provision in this section, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, it's time for me to report progress. And now, order, please. Can I have someone to act as a temporary chair, please? Honourable, can you come here, please? What you have to do is read that out. When I come here, read that out. You come stand here.
What shall we do now? What shall we do now?
Members, the House is resumed. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the committee has considered the Social Assistance Portability to Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau Bill and reports it without amendment. The committee has also considered the Environmental Reporting Bill and reports progress. Mr. Speaker, I move that the report be adopted.
The question is that the report be adopted. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The Social Assistance Portability to Cook Islands, Niue and Tokelau Bill is set down for third reading next sitting day. The Environmental Reporting Bill is set down for further consideration in committee next sitting day. And members, the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. Good evening.